Welcome back, everyone, and this is the second part of our ISQM1 UK Unwrapped, where we are featuring Lesley Byrne giving some valuable insights and tips to firms as they go about designing and implementing their systems of quality management. So let's cut to the chase, Lesley. Where do we start in this process?
I think the important thing is to start and not let it be too daunting is the first message. Actually, when you get into it, it's not as bad as all that, but it is really just about kind of ripping that Band-Aid off and getting started, because once you're in it, it's much easier than you think. So the first thing is read the standard. It's amazing. I can't believe sometimes the number of firms we go around who just rely on their audit programs and have not actually read the ISA requirements. You can't get away with that here. You really do need to read the standard. But the standard is not that easy sometimes to digest. I know, having had to unpick the whole thing over the last 2 years, it's not that easy a standard, but it is important to read. So in that case, we also would like to point you to the First Time Implementers Guide by the IASB. Now, I think just to bear in mind that First Implementers Guide is based on the international standard rather than the UK standard. And so you just have to remember there that there are UK pluses, but you can see them very easily if you go into the UK standard on the FRC website. The bits that are kind of in grey are the bits that are added on additional for the UK. So combination of the two would be good. So get your standard from the FRC website, and then go into the IASB website, which is on the IFAC overall website, and have a look at the implementation guide to start with. But we are also going to talk later on, aren't we, James, about our implementation guide at the end.
Yes, we will.
So that's number one. Number two, when you read through the standard, start to think about what's relevant to you. Not all of it is going to be relevant. We've got an awful lot of firms out there who are sole practitioners, 1-2 partner firms, you know, and this is aimed at everybody. So there will be bits of the standard that actually you can disregard. But I think the important thing is, if you think something's not applicable to you, it's probably a good idea to record why it's not applicable to you. Then you've got a full audit trail when we come along in the monitoring side and say, why haven't you got objectives, risks and responses in place in relation to governance or whatever? You can justify why and say, I have thought about it, but the reason I haven't implied it is because X, Y, and Z. So think about what's relevant to you and what's not. So for example, if you're a sole practitioner with no staff, clearly when it talks about objective risks and responses in relation to, you know, personnel and training and all that kind of stuff, not all of it's going to apply to you. Or if there's bits in relation to governance that are more aimed towards a larger firm, again, it's not necessarily going to apply to you. But it's important that you think about it. Record if you think it's not relevant to you, because then at least you've got your thought processes there. So that's number two. Now, the next thing is, how are you going to tackle this? How are you going to record everything? So you need to think about whether you're going to do it all yourself. You know, are you going to use, for example, an Excel spreadsheet? I would suggest that something like a Word document is maybe a wee bit tricky, that you might be better with Excel if you are going to do it yourself. Or are you going to use a commercial product? That is your decision. That's not something I can really influence here. There are quite a lot of commercial products now in the market. They've only really come out in the last year. If you do need some help signposting you to various products, practice support can do that. They do have a list of potential providers out there that you can go to. It's not something I can opine on, because obviously that would be crossing into conflicts of interest there, because I have to be able to maintain my independence in doing the monitoring. But if you do need help and support, you can ask practice support. But the very important thing is, if you are purchasing a commercial product, the last thing we want to see is it with a nice shiny cellophane on it. I mean, I'm joking there, obviously it's all software now, but you must tailor it to your firm. You know, in the past, when we've gone and seen policies and procedures that have been purchased, it wasn't unusual for us to see things that weren't tailored to the firm. In this case, you absolutely would not get away with that, because as we covered in the last video, the whole thing is, it's the system of quality management is unique to your firm. It's unique to your firm's situation, your nature and circumstances, the types of clients you have, the number of partners you've got, and so on. And so, you know, buying a commercial off-the-shelf package and just plugging it and playing it is not going to work. you're going to have to do some work in tailoring the contents of that commercial product to your firm's circumstances. But we're not pushing you down that line. The decision whether you do it all yourself with Excel or whatever, or you do a commercial product, is your decision.
I think that's absolutely essential, Lesley, as you highlight there. That is a firm decision. Yes, they can play a part of a firm system of quality management, but that's a decision for the firm to make. And as you say, it's really for the firm to accept its responsibility as per the standard for the system of quality management, and it can decide how it wants to achieve that.
Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the objectives, Lesley, where do we start?
Well, actually, you've already got some of the answers there already, right in the standard. So the first thing is, that's why I said read the standard, because actually if you go to the standard, you will see that there are mandatory objectives. So that's your starting point. So there are a number of things. It sets up a number of objectives for each of the components, you know, so you'll see there's objectives for governance and leadership, there's objectives for acceptance and continuance, and so on. So that is the place you start. You record them in whatever mechanism you've decided to record it, whether it's an Excel or whether it's using the commercial product. So start with your mandatory objectives. Remember, as I said, not all of them will apply. And the whole point of this is it's tailored to your firm's circumstances. So if you can justify that something does not apply to you, then please record that justification. Record each objective in whatever mechanism you have. So it might be just a case of, if it is as simple as an Excel, you've got an Excel with each objective numbered, and that's your starting point. But what you need to think about is, do you need to add in anything more that's not in the standard? You may find that there are other objectives out there that are also applicable to your firm that are not included in the standard. Now, that is more likely the bigger you get, more complex you get. Certainly, when we were rolling it out in our international network, we added in quite a lot of additional objectives that firms could then select from our library. But in a very small firm, it might just be that actually the objectives in the standard are sufficient.
I mean, I think that's very true, Lesley, that, you know, it may well be the case, but the firm, of course, has to go through that exercise itself to make sure there are no additional quality objectives. And then if we look at the risks, you know, where are we starting here? Because obviously this is absolutely fundamental to how this system of quality management is meant to function.
Now, this is the hard bit, actually. This is the bit that is the most tricky of setting your objectives, risks and responses, because this is the bit we don't really have anything on. Because if you think that the objectives are already in the standard, we'll talk later about the responses, and you actually do have stuff in that already. This is the big gap. And actually, this is the most important part of the whole thing, because this is all about risk-based quality management and identifying your unique risks. So it's not in the standard, they are unique to your firm. You really need to think about what have the biggest impact to your firm. You're not required to look at every single risk out there and think it applies to you. You need to think about the risks that are most prevalent and the greatest impact on your firm's audit quality. So that's the first point. And so there's a test there. Is there a reasonable possibility of it occurring and having a combination, having an adverse effect really on one or more objectives? So that's the test. Now, you need to consider each objective carefully, really, and think about what could go wrong to identify the risks. And what could go wrong can be very different between a small firm and a large firm. As I said, I think in the last video, if you think about COVID as an example of a risk that was out there, how it impacted every single firm is very different. You know, some people were geared up to be able to do remote working, others weren't, and so on. So what could go wrong is very different for each firm, and that's a question you have to ask. But what we're going to do now is maybe take you through some examples, because it's a very difficult concept to kind of grasp to start with. So we're going to talk about maybe some examples of the types of risks that you could consider. So I think the very important thing, first of all, was the big thing in red that you'll see on every single slide. These are not an exhaustive list of risks. What I do not want to see is my monitoring team going out and doing reviews and only finding these risks and saying, this is what audit monitoring told us to do. This is absolutely not what I'm telling you to do here. What I'm saying is, here's some examples just to try and get your juices flowing and start to think about this. So please think about the risks that are unique to your firm. So I'm just going to take you through a number of kind of risks for each of the components here. So first of all, what are your risks in relation to the risk assessment component? Well, probably the main risks are, everybody's new to this, so maybe not understanding the role in risk assessment, maybe missing risks, maybe not conducting a proper risk assessment or not responding to the risks appropriately. So that's just some examples of risks in relation to risk assessment. It's a bit weird doing risks in relation to risk assessment, but
so Lesley, does that then mean it's better to get a few people together to kind of discuss this so that people are kind of bouncing off one another?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's if you've got that ability in your firm, I think you should go for that. Certainly in our network, when we were doing it, a lot of the firms in our network had, like, so for example, they would allocate out the components to different people. So if you had an ethics partner, they would get the ethics partner to go in and think about the ethics related risks. They would get the person responsible for training to go away and think about, CPD or learning and development related risks and so on. And then they came together and then they discussed it so that they were kind of dividing up the work and then bouncing the ideas off each other. That's a good approach to take, I think. But obviously not everybody has that ability. So it's very much dependent on the size of your firm. But where you can, I think, having a collaborative approach to this is important. So looking at governance and leadership next, as an example, with some obvious things here. Commercial trumping quality. This is where you've got, the leadership in the firm more focused on, growing and commercial fees and so on, rather than thinking about the quality in the firm. So, the focus of the firm isn't right. So that's a big risk. Growth plans, not taking account of quality management. So an example there is, it's not just, unusual for us to have gone out to firms who have acquired practices over time. And what they haven't done is they actually haven't tried to manage the standards across all those firms. So they're still operating independently of each other. And what they're not doing is ensuring consistent standards across the whole practice. That's a very common thing we've seen in the past. So obviously that's the kind of thing you would be, if you're quite an acquisitive firm and you're growing by acquisition, then one of the things you need to think about is, how do you manage growth in your quality management? So that's a big risk. But that's not going to, again, apply to everybody. That's only going to apply to firms that grow in that way. Other things, like firms, culture and leadership, not focusing on quality or ethics, not getting the right messages out to the staff that ethics is important, for example. Leadership being stretched and not giving enough attention to quality. Mergers, new people joining the firm and maybe using other systems that the core practice is not using, or staff that are not trained in the ways of the new firm or the culture in the new firm and so on. These are typical things we see all the time. But also the very important there is actually to do with actually being able to react to changes in circumstances, because remember, this is all about the circle of life and how things change. And if your system of quality management can't adapt to change, then it's not an effective system of quality management. Sorry, James.
No, just on that point about the firm's culture leadership, the point we discussed earlier about who's responsible, being at the very top of the firm, I think hopefully will assist in ensuring that such risks, are appropriately dealt with. But obviously it is a risk.
Absolutely. And when you're setting your system of quality management, it is very important that CEO, managing partner is involved in this. They will have maybe a different lens as well from the audit compliance partner. And together you're getting a kind of good foundation of risks there. So there's some examples right there. Moving into client acceptance and continuance, maybe accepting clients on the basis of, the money that's coming in, the good fee that is generated by that client, but not thinking about the quality risks that client could bring in. Accepting clients you don't have competence to be able to do, or maybe accepting clients, for example, that are specialists in nature that you don't have that specialist expertise or grounding in. One that I've seen quite a lot in my time is accepting clients with limitation scope. So You know, another auditor has resigned from the audit because their audit was limited, that there wasn't evidence available. And then another auditor picks it up and says, well, you know, we'll gloss over that. So that's an important thing. If, you know, if the client's not giving you all the information and explanations or evidence required, you know, to do the audit, you shouldn't be accepting that client at the outset. So that's a big risk. And then things like, you know, clients who are up to no good, essentially, you know, clients with, you know, you've got concerns over the integrity of the clients or a money laundering, whatever, obviously would not be good. So that's a risk. So these are just examples of client acceptance and continuance. Moving on to ethics, you know, taking on clients where you clearly breach the ethical standards. So, you know, you're taking on clients where you're breaching fee dependence, or you're taking on clients where you're already doing services for them that are in conflict with the audit, those sorts of things. I mean, I know, James, ethics is very close to your heart. Is there anything you want to say on that here?
Well, taking both of these together, I think what's really clear is that the due diligence that has to be done before accepting a client and even continuing with a client.
Yeah.
Because there could be major risks if this is not done properly, and they will then, you know, come back to bite a firm at a later date. So if this can be done, you know, to a real high quality standard, then hopefully that mitigates the risks of some of these risks then coming to bear at a future date. And as you say, Lesley, ethics absolutely essential at the heart of ICAS. And so firms really do need to consider these aspects about what other engagements have they done, for example, as you mentioned, for a potential audit client. Would that then have an impact in terms of the FRC's ethical standards requirements? The fee dependence one can become an issue as well, you know, just something to monitor in certain firms.
Yep.
Of course, we saw the change in the long association in the last revision to the FRC's ethical standard in 2019, and, you know, the resulting implications of that. So I think it just really hammers home to me the importance of properly doing this assessment before you accept a client or indeed continue with a client.
And it goes beyond that, because not only have you got to think about that in each engagement, this is what it's driving you to do is think about this in the round. So for my base of clients, for my firm, what are the potential risks that could come and bite us? So, you know, do we have potential, all our client base out there, are the potential for long association risks? For all our clients out there, do we have any there's fee dependence issues and so on? So it's even a stage before the engagement itself. You know, it's really thinking about in the round, are there issues here? So that's why we were saying it's more proactive rather than think about it once you get to the engagement, is in totality now thinking in advance, are any of these risks going to come in and get us? So that's an important thing here. So moving into engagement performance risk, now again, the list could be endless. Again, this is not exhaustive in any stretch of the imagination, but just some examples that we see out there. You know, it's not unusual for us to see firms setting audit fees too low to get the business and then having to cut corners on the audit. Ineffective staffing can be a big issue. So you could have toxic combinations of staff that just don't get on and therefore are never going to have a very good sort of audit team vibe or be able to be very, very effective as an audit team. These things happen. You may have a very kind of difficult client and therefore you need to make sure that you've got strong staff that can stand up to them and so on. So if you've got kind of weaker staff in a particular audit, that could be a bit of a disaster. Insufficient staffing obviously is a big issue that many firms face. So these are the kind of things that can have an impact and not the kind of things we used to discuss really on monitoring visits before. So it is making us, it's back to that, remember we talked about root cause analysis in the last video. What are the root causes of the issues? It's not that staff just haven't gone in training. It's actually back to the role allocations of teams and all that kind of stuff is important. One we see a lot, partners not directing and supervising and controlling the audits the way they should be, tight deadlines, tight budgets, partners under pressure, changes in requirements, that the engagement checklists and everything that the firm is using are maybe not up to date with the requirements, consultations being rushed or audits being rushed at the last minute, because of tight deadlines. Audit files not being closed down in time, documentation, you name it, they're all in there. And, these are things that, we see on a daily basis, and therefore it's things to think about as, from a firm point of view, are any of these applicable to you?
And what's important here again, Liz, as well, is the linkage between a lot of these.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And, you know, that is something that has to be considered, because that then leads you to the very last one there, the missed audit report qualifications modifications. So if there's real tight deadlines, time pressures, partners are under pressure, then there are real risks that ultimately you may not issue the appropriate audit opinion, or, you know, you may not be giving proper consideration to matters such as going concern. And obviously that will then probably then be reflected in the documentation, which again will be, as we all know, is one of the areas from a regulation perspective. Documentation can be a real issue for firms, and a lot of what went on in the audit may be in someone's head, but actually we need the real key aspects to be documented.
You're absolutely right. So this is why we're saying it's kind of iterative, and, you know, it's all interconnected, that, you know, and you have a snowball effect here. You know, you put a combination of not enough staff, or staff that don't get on, or tight deadlines, or whatever all together, you could find a disaster in an audit. And it's not, you know, if you read some of the, for example, the FRC disciplinary cases, quite often they get into those sorts of issues, and it's often a combination of, you know, kind of other underlying causes like these that are, you know, can cause issues on an audit, not necessarily the things you obviously used to think about in the past. So that's why it's really important in doing this for your firm that this is a step back. You know, it's a stand back and think about this from an overall firm point of view, because what the whole point of this is if you can anticipate this, you can hopefully stop it from happening or mitigate it. Whereas if it just hits you on an audit, then it's a more difficult thing, and it's a more immediate thing you have to resolve. This is, you know, allowing you to stand back and think about these challenges you have as a firm, and try and think about how you're going to deal with these challenges up front. Okay, moving on to resources. As we mentioned, it's not just about human resources, but I thought it's big enough an issue that there's so many potential human resources issues. I thought I would separate them out. You know, what we're talking about here is issues in relation to recruitment, about the behaviour of people, about people's understanding, about who's allocated what roles in the firm, what their competence is, about the learning and development of the firm. It's a very, very wide category, this. So there's one at the very top that probably a lot of firms have faced recently: the inability to recruit, you know, proper, appropriate audit staff, and generally having a lack of personnel to deal with engagement services is a real challenge for a lot of firms. Similarly, the next one, succession planning. You know, there's a lot of firms out there who are, you know, facing the prospect of not having the ability to put audits down to, you know, the next level, the new leaders in the firm. So that can be a real challenge. People not having the integrity, competency, authority, or experience for the role. Now, actually, when, you know, a lot of this we broke down when I did it in the network, we broke down a lot further into far more granular risks. You could just cover it in one big risk like this, or you could split it out. So just to unpack that, you may have staff that don't have the integrity, therefore they're not going to raise ethics issues if they find them. You know, they're going to cut corners. You don't want that. Competence is important. Having the authority, if you've got an audit compliance partner, for example, they need to have the authority to do that job properly, and having experience in the role. So if you don't have any of these things, these are real risks to your practice. Behavioural, again, you know, we look at all the new standards that are out there, the ISA 315 revised, the ISA 540 revised. It's all about professional skepticism, isn't it, James? And that's what a lot of people struggle with, you know, is thinking outside the box, not going for the collaborative mindset, challenging the client in relation to audits. And that's potentially a risk for firms. You know, have they got staff that actually can challenge? And actually, again, going back to the FRC, you know, that was one of the biggest issues I think they found across a lot of the disciplinary cases and the AQRT inspection results, was the inability of people to exercise professional skepticism. So that could be a real risk for a lot of firms.
Well, it's really highlighted here, Lesley, the importance of people in the system of quality management.
Totally.
I mean, this is absolutely, this slide to me just makes it absolutely crystal clear, because whilst they are obviously one of your biggest assets as a service-based business, they can also be one of the biggest risks. And, you know, what you've set out here just gives a lot of food for thought, I think, for some of the firms when they are considering, you know, what they should be doing in this regard.
Absolutely. So I'll not go through them all, but you'll see there's a lot about understanding the role, understanding what my job is, understanding, the requirements that you need to fulfill in your job. Is the learning development sufficient for the staff? Is the training suitable for the staff? Is it timely enough? Does it respond to changes enough? Are people being rewarded for taking the right approach to quality, or advancement and reward happening without regard to quality? These are all potential risks. Now, this is, again, not exhaustive. These were just ones I picked off the top of my head, really. But it just shows you that you could go on for quite a long time in relation just to people risks. Looking at other resources, as I said, in the new ISQM 1, we're moving away from human resources, which was the bit we just covered, to resources wider. So here we're talking about, technical resources. Is the audit tool you're using up to date? Or is that a risk? Does it have all the content you need? Is your service provider, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute, are they releasing updates to the software in time? For example, ISO 315, has your audit software changed for that, and so on. So resources is very important. Similarly, time on audits, deadlines and things like that we've talked about already, making sure technology is updated, making sure if you're a part of a network that the network resources are fit for your purpose. There's a big bit in the standard about that, and I'm not going to go into detail because, given the number of firms that we have, we're probably not in a network, it's more relevant. But if you are in a network, you should read the standard requirements in relation to network resources. So that's other resources. And then moving into things like information and communications, this is all about being clear in things like responsibilities. So, a risk is that your firm's policies and procedures or your firm's culture are not clearly communicated to your staff, or it's not done on a timely basis. So staff don't know what the expectations are for their role. Not communicating monitoring results out. So, people don't learn from mistakes. Not communicating with your PII insurer when you should, and so on. There's so many of them, but that was just a couple of examples of sorts of risks to think about there. And then monitoring remediation. A number of you would be very familiar with this, so you may have compliance reviewers that don't have the competence or understanding to do the role. They're not experienced enough in it. You might not have enough time and resources to dedicate to it because you're all stretched. There's the old risks of self-review. If you're a sole practitioner, it's very difficult to do proper independent monitoring. That's why in the standard it still requires that at least every 3 years you get an external review. Self-review is very difficult. That you're monitoring, you haven't included all the RIs maybe in your monitoring, or you haven't scoped in all the different types of clients that you have that are potentially different sorts of risks out there, that you haven't communicated results of the review, that you haven't identified the root causes of the issues, or you haven't tracked the actions. They're quite obvious points, but it's just to kind of show you that every single component has risks. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just, off the top of the head, and just to kind of get your juices flowing, really, as I said before, to start thinking about, are any of these familiar to you?
I think, Lesley, what you said there illustrates that once people start this, I'm sure they will start to be able to identify far more of the risks which are really pertinent to their firm, but it's just getting started.
It's getting started is the important thing, absolutely. And I mean, we'll come back to this in a minute, but everybody I know that has implemented this has not had a one-pass approach to this. What they've done is they've taken a deep breath, they've got the objectives in the standard, they've started to kind of brainstorm the risks, they've set them down in paper, they've moved on to the responses, and we'll come on to that in a minute. They've then gone back and revisited it again, and maybe again a third time, so get it down, start the process, start to think about it, and you just chip away at it and chip away at it until you get it into a kind of form that you want it to be in. So, and as you said, once you start to brainstorm it, actually, it becomes second nature. It's just we're not all necessarily thinking that way, but we should be able to do this as auditors because we've been doing it at our clients, so we should be able to do it here.
Yeah, I mean, even those in firms, that maybe not have too many people internally. They can speak with other firms. I mean, they must have contacts and so forth to share similar experiences, although obviously the system has to be unique to their firm. I think this idea of bouncing ideas off others and sharing experiences really can assist, in the process of designing and then implementing, the system.
Absolutely. And I think, there'll be a role there for monitoring. I mean, obviously our job is to do monitoring, but no doubt my monitoring team, when they go out and do visits, once we start to see what's out there and who's doing what, I'm sure we'll, be sharing our thoughts and views to the firms on, kind of learning points and things like that. So that should help as well. I think the other thing to bear in mind is if you are going to use a commercial package, which we talked about at the very beginning, most of the commercial offerings out there are including libraries of potential risks, and therefore it's already given you a starting point. So if you are thinking about going down the commercial product list, then you should be able to get some help with your risks there. But I think the really important thing is, as I said before, if you're using a commercial product, don't just plug in the risks that you've been given, because if there's no tailoring and we come along as a monitoring team and say you've got risks in relation to PI audit clients, for example, and you don't have any PI audit clients, then you haven't thought about this, and and then that's worse than never having done it at all in some ways. So basically, please, if you're using a commercial product, please do go down the risks and think about which ones are applicable to you and which ones are not. So moving on, once we've identified the risks, remember what we said before is you need to assess them, and that should be very familiar to everybody because it's very like a risk register, in that what you're doing here is you are assessing the likelihood of it happening and the impact if it does happen. There's different ways of recording it.
Yeah, I see in the slide there, Lesley, you have highlighted there's different ways. What sort of advice would you give to firms here in terms of determining what way should they approach this?
I think it depends on the nature of your firm and how complex the firm is. So obviously probably the easiest thing is just putting high, medium, low risk to each. So, so the simplest thing is having an Excel, identify the risk, and then have a column for likelihood, a column for impact, and then assess it as high, medium, or low, likelihood, high, medium, or low impact, and therefore what is it overall. That's the easiest way of doing that, and that might be okay for some sole practitioners, for example. But the more complex the firm gets, as in the bigger the firm is, that doesn't give you priority. That's the problem with that. It's just giving you high, medium, and low. It's probably not enough of a spectrum of risk. So that's where you might, the bigger you get, want to think about scoring. So you could score, instead of a column that has high, medium, low for likelihood, high, medium, low for impact, you could have risk bands, risk scores, and then score them and add up the total score, and then you've automatically got your priority of things that you need to look at. The alternative is using a risk matrix, and that is where you are essentially plotting where that risk is, so impacts on one axis, likelihood is in the other, and you're plotting where it is. Now, certainly when we did it in the international network, we used the risk matrix approach. The reason we did that was because if you go to things like ISA 315 now, and also when you look at ISA 540, etc., we talk about the spectrum of risk. We're no longer talking about high, medium, low anymore, really, in audit. Those days are gone. We're talking about a scale now, and therefore we felt it was appropriate to use a kind of a spectrum approach. And I think we had, I can't remember how many it was it maybe 12? 12 squares along the way and 12 squares up the way. So it was quite a big graph, and it basically gradiated from green into amber into red, and then you plotted it, and that's how we did it. But a score would be equally as good. So which one would I recommend? I think it depends on your firm. Getting back to your original question, I think smaller firms might be able to get away with a simpler approach, but the problem is, how do you then prioritize? So you might want to think about scoring a risk matrix.
So on responses, Lesley, we've had the objectives, we've had the risks, now the responses, and this is something that's maybe more familiar to those who will be applying this, because that's what ISQC1 is. They really were at the responses without giving consideration as to how we got there. So what would you like to tell those who are watching what they really need to consider in terms of responses?
Absolutely. You should be back in the kind of comfort zone by the time you get to responses, because that was the starting point for ISQC1, as we said in the first video, that, you know, essentially it's your policies and procedures that will mitigate your risks. Now, if I were you, I would start with what you already have, and then I would try and match them to the risks that you've identified. And then that should start to tease out the gaps. So you might find, for example, that you might find you have policies and procedures, but you haven't identified a risk. Then you're going to have to think, actually, was my risk assessment complete or not? Or actually, do I not need this policy or procedure anymore? It's probably more likely to be the first thing, that maybe you've missed a risk that you had forgotten about. So it's a good kind of, it gives you a kind of good sort of safety net there, because you've already got some, you know, procedures in place. So that's one approach to it. But I think more likely way around this will go is you'll have gaps, to be honest, because you're now thinking much wider than the previous ISQC1 standard. You're thinking much wider on your risks. So in all likelihood, you'll probably find you have risks without any policies and procedures, and therefore will have to set some up. Now, there is a starting point here, in addition to your existing policies and procedures. In the standard, it has mandatory responses. So these are the things you have to have in place. So you've got another kind of reference point there, you know, of other policies and procedures you need to think about. So that's important. And I think, in actual fact, if you look at the UK standard particularly, there's quite a lot more in there than even the international standard. So, so you've got that as a starting point. You've also got other things you can reference. You know, James, do you want to say something about this guide?
Yeah. Just the ISSB issued in terms of non-authoritative guidance, the IFAC first time implementation guide, and that's available on their website, and you know, there will be links to that on the ICAS website and so forth. And that is really useful for those who might be finding the standard just that wee bit difficult to comprehend at a first reading. You do have to read it, but I think you may find that the language used in the IFAC implementation guide actually is something which might be easier, at least for a first read. Then it does have a lot of useful information there in terms of, you know, the likely nature of the risk, timing and extent and so forth. So I would advise people that it's well worth a read to go to this particular document, and obviously you have to supplement that with reading the actual UK standard, because Lesley has highlighted there are a number of additional pluses there which are clearly marked in the grey text. But I do think this is a very useful starting point.
Yeah, and what it's getting you to do there, if you look at it, is think, when you're thinking about setting up responses that you've not had before, think about the three aspects of it. You know, what is the nature of the issue you're trying to resolve? How often do you need to try and put this response in place? Is this a kind of periodic thing, or is it a daily thing? And what is the extent of the issue? So that helps just frame the responses in a particular kind of framework for you. So it's maybe something that's useful to refer to. But what I would say about responses is this word stand back, which James will be very familiar with. This is a concept was it ISA 540 that brought it out, James, or was it before then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was 540, but I mean, a lot of firms may have been using something similar previous to that, even before it was put into the standards. But this aspect of standing back and really considering, where are we? What have we done? What have we still to do? What have we missed? There's various aspects to this, but it is really becoming very much a kind of key component of auditing standards which are being released. And it's this ability really just to stand back and not get overwhelmed with everything else that's going on. And I think this is really important in this particular standard.
It's not getting bogged down in the detail, isn't it?
Exactly, Lesley, yes. And if you can manage to do that, I think that then does allow you to bring that more objective opinion as to where are we in terms of this system of quality management. are there any further gaps, any further risks which we haven't properly considered? And it just allows that to really complete the picture. And of course, you know, this is something that you may wish to do at a regular basis in this, because the firm will evolve, the nature of the engagements you undertake will evolve, and external factors will involve. But just this ability really to stand back and try and give it a more objective perspective.
Yeah, so what we mean by stand back is, as James said, go through it the first time. So set up your objectives from the standard. You've already gone through and you've ripped that band-aid off and you've considered what the risks. In fact, I see I've got a band-aid there for responses. That was maybe not the best analogy, but anyway, you've already identified your first pass of what you think your risks are. And then you've got your existing policies and procedures, and you've got what is mandatory in the standard for responses. So you've now done a first pass, objective risk responses. Stand back. Okay, is there any that maybe don't apply to us that we can, you know, get rid of and therefore, you know, record that? Are there any we need to unpack in more detail? Is there anything we've missed? And, you know, you should be able to identify gaps. So as I said, if you've got policies and procedures, but you've not identified risks, then you know that you need to add in some risks. If you've got risks and you haven't identified policies and procedures, you need to think about what those responses should be, and you start to remediate them. And the gaps, obviously, as we said, there are particularly policies and procedures, as I said, that don't mitigate the risks effectively. Or the other thing that will be relevant here is if you've had a monitoring visit or you've had a compliance review and it's highlighted some issues, even with your system of quality control, as was, then you know that you may have to, you know, additionally add in some further controls or policies and procedures into your responses as well. So this is a constant thing. So I mean, I would guess that you're having a couple of passes at it. Basically, you take a deep breath, you set it up to start with, set up your objective risk responses, revisit it again, and then you'll start to get it into shape you want it to. And that's certainly the feedback I got from the firms that I worked with. That was what they did, because if you think about it too much and don't start, you'll never get there. You know, it's just a case of getting on with it, start to think about it, get the first lot recorded, and then go back and revisit it.
Again, it comes back to this getting started, Lesley. You know, once you're started, you're then moving towards getting the system in place.
Yep.
But it's just getting started.
It's getting started, and then it's not that bad. It's actually not that bad once you get into it. Now, there's one thing we wanted to pick up on that we didn't talk about in the first video, and that is service providers. You know, there's quite a lot of vibes around this out in the marketplace. And what this is about is, bearing in mind you have to set your objectives, risks and responses that are under your control. It's your system of quality management. You do, however, rely on third parties for certain things in your system of quality management. So you may have, for example, audit tools like, you know, Caseware or Pro Audit or Inflow or something like that, for example. So that means they are a service provider. You may have, you know, manuals out there by somebody else, like Mercia, for example. You could have training done by ICAS. You know, there's various things that you might have outsourced to somebody else. And if you're outsourcing certain things, you cannot absolve responsibility. It is your responsibility. It's your system of quality management. And so the whole thing is, you need to consider whether what you have given for from third-party providers is suitable and fit for purpose for your firm, given your firm's nature and circumstances. So to do that, to consider the objectives, risks, particularly the risks, actually, you know, the risks in relation to the things that you are purchasing in, what you need to do is probably get information from those service providers. And what we cover in the next slide is just, you know, things to think about. So, for example, if you've got an audit tool, you know, what is the experience, capabilities, competence of the service provider? You know, is the technical content good? Is it properly scoped? How do they make sure that they've got all the ISA requirements in there? How do they make sure they keep it up to date? How are they doing version updates? You know, how do they provide training on the software? How do they support it? You know, what happens if there's an issue with it? There's bugs, etc. How does that get fixed? What's the customer support like, and so on? You need to think about all of those things. And And, you know, if it's IT related, you've got other aspects like security, GDPR and things like that you need to think about as well. Obviously, not all these things are relevant for every single thing, every single service that you purchase, but you need to have a wee think about these things for each of them. So inevitably what it will involve is contacting those service providers, asking them these questions. A lot of them will have answers already prepared because most of them know that ISQM1 is now here, and therefore they have to provide this information. They've already been providing it to people that have implemented ISQM1 already, and so therefore we'll be able to provide you with this information for you then to assess whether that service is fit for purpose. Is there anything else you would like to say on that, James?
No, I think you've covered the main points there, Lesley, but obviously these service providers will be ready with, you know, the responses because they have been providing this information and they were aware it was coming. So they will be able to provide the firms that are involved in this work with the, you know, the responses which they need, because obviously some of these service providers could play a key part of any system of quality management. And of course that will vary from firm to firm. But, you know, it is essential that they get this information because it is crucial if they are relying on these service providers for any part of what you've described there, that they are aware that the risks and how these service providers mitigate those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other thing to think about, I think, when you're setting your system of quality management, we've taken you through each of the different stages, is whatever you are using to record, and you must record all your thought processes, because what we're going to be doing when we come in audit monitoring is looking at your progress, you know, looking at how you've set your objectives, how you've done your risk identification, your risk assessment, how you've done your responses. The important thing is that actually it's not linear. The whole thing is quite interconnected and quite complicated. And what I mean by that is, you know, the relationships are not one-to-one. So each objective can have many risks. Each risk in return may affect more than one objective. Each risk may have many responses, and each response may address more than one risk. The whole thing's many to many and quite complicated. So if you are not using a commercial platform, software platform, then you're going to have to present that in some way on your Excel. So in other words, I think there'd probably be duplications unless you're a fancy database whiz or something like that. And I have to say that when we rolled out our network platform, it was a database related tool, but most firms will not have that. Then if you're thinking about Excel, for example, things like that, you will have duplication. So for example, competence, you know, risk is probably going to impact a number of different components of the, you know, a number of different objectives that you've got out there, you know. So you've got to bear in mind that there will be times where you might be repeating yourself, but that's okay. You are on the right track. You know, there is an interrelationship there. But obviously the simpler firm you are, probably the less you have to worry about this. But obviously for the bigger firms, that might be a bit of an issue.
I think the key there, as you've said, Lesley, on the slide, relationships are not one-to-one.
Yeah.
So it really is important that people do consider, you know, the interactions between these various quality objective risks and responses.
And then what's next? As we said before, it's not a one and done. It is an iterative process. And actually taking, you know, just that diagram from the IFAC first time implementers guide, you'll see there that, you know, once you've set your objectives, risks and responses, it says identify information indicating you need to, you know, add or modify them. So bearing in mind that what we said at the very beginning was this is a system of quality management that is unique to your firm, that represents your firm's nature and circumstances. When your nature and circumstances change, you need to adapt your system of quality management. So, for example, your firm merges, there's merger risks there you need to address. If you have a new client base, you're moving into a new area, for example, let's say you're moving into the pie market, those are new risks that you have to address. If you get a change in principles, you know, key partner's retired, and new partners come in, you've got two different lots of risks there, you know, both in relation to the partner leaving and the partner joining. You know, if you get changes in standards or changes in ethical requirements, they need to be factored into your system quality management. So this is a living, breathing thing, and therefore you need to keep it up to date. Now, how often do you keep it up to date? Well, you should be horizon scanning for issues. Obviously, that is part of the job of the person with operational and the ultimate person responsible to think about emerging risks, things that could be coming down the track, because this is what it's all about. It's about proactive quality management, anticipating before things hit the fan, basically. So you should be looking out for this. But what I would also advise is you do a periodic review as well. And what we recommended in the network I was working in was that to start with, that firms should do a quarterly review, just go down their objective risk responses quarterly and just make sure they're still up to date, just in case something slips through the cracks that you've forgotten about. Now, that might be too much, maybe for some smaller firms where nothing's happening, it's not that, there's not that many staff changes or things like that. That's up to you to decide. It's, the power is your power. You need to think about how often you think is appropriate. But obviously the absolute kind of least frequent, I think, should be at least once a year, but I would recommend quarterly to start with until this thing beds down.
Lesley, you talked there about new client base, but let's just consider an existing client that suddenly, takes over another business, completely unrelated, completely new risks. Again, another aspect there for firms to consider, that clients won't stand still either.
Yep, absolutely. So, or you've got a very acquisitive client, for example, that could, that has major impacts on your audit and so on. So you do need to think about all these potential risks. Or there's something comes out about a client that, questions their integrity, for example. All these things need to be thought about. So it does need a person there dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, just to kind of think about the issues. And that's why things like information and communication within the firm are really important as well. The partners, other people who become aware of issues should be feeding it into the person responsible for this. Well, now moving on to the dark side, the monitoring side.
Certainly not the dark side, Lesley. Certainly not the dark side.
The bright side, the bright side of life, I don't know. This is where, what is our role in all of this? Well, obviously, as you'll know, that is going to be a real focus of our monitoring going forward. As you'll all know from the past, ISQC1 was a big focus. ISQM1 will be a big focus going forward. I think the important thing to set out to start with is, we know this is new to everybody. The expectations on firms, I think the smaller firm you are, the more, simpler it can be, and the more we know that it'll be more difficult for you. Whereas obviously large firms that are parts of networks, for example, should be well geared to have, fully complied with this. But I think the important thing is, we're not looking for perfection. As James said, it's half the battle's getting started. The outcomes on monitoring would be a lot worse for you if you have not grasped the nettle and you have not started this. Because if you don't even know there's a new standard coming out, that's bad, obviously. If you haven't started it at all or thought about it at all, that's also not so good either. But if you've actually started to work on this, you've got your objectives down and you've done initial risk assessment, even if it's not perfect, and you've thought about your firm's policies and procedures and you've identified gaps, that's a really good starting place and you're on track. That's kind of what we'll be looking for when we do the monitoring, that firms, are on track, and that you've got a plan of action of how you're going to plug the gaps. These are the important things. So obviously, as monitoring team, we will really be focusing on your firm's risk assessments. As I said, we want to make sure that you have thought about your risks. This is the key to all of this. And therefore thought about, the likelihood and impact of those risks that are unique to your firm. But as we said, we are trying to take an educational approach there. But we do expect firms by the 15th of December to have had, a first attempt at this. I don't know if there's any more that you want me to say there, James, or if I scared everybody enough.
No, I mean, to me, it's like sitting any examination. If you sit with a blank piece of paper, you've got zero.
Yeah, exactly.
So the getting started, and your firm, you know how to risk assess. So all the skill sets are within your firm to be able to do this. And as Lesley says, it won't be perfect to begin with, but nothing. No. So don't let great get in the way of good in this.
Yeah, we're not looking for Rolls Royces.
No, and it's this applying the skill sets that you use externally as part of what you do, and doing that internally. You will be able to identify the risks then you obviously have to assess, you know, how much of a threat they are. And then it's about putting in appropriate responses. And as Leslie's highlighted, you may well have responses in the firm at the moment in terms of your policies and procedures that might meet some of these risks, might not meet them all, but a lot might already be in place. But you have to go through the full exercise to ensure that you have properly designed and implemented the system of quality management that will comply with the new standard.
Yeah. You've got your responses and you're linking them back to the risks you've identified. Very important. Yeah. So I think that's mainly it.
Well, thank you very much.
James.
Thank you very much, Lesley. And I'm sure everyone has really benefited there from, you know, the insights you provided, which, you know, I think will be invaluable to a number of people who are going about this process. And just to conclude, we'd like to highlight some of the useful resources, some of which we have mentioned, some of which we haven't. But there is a page on the ICAS website that details all the various resources which are available from ICAS and from the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. And we did refer to the implementation guide during this session. There's the ICAS webinar where I spoke to Graham Marshbanks from Johnson Carmichael and Keith McPherson from Henderson Logie, and they provided insights from their firms as well. You know, but how you go about this, what are the key things you have to consider? So again, if you haven't watched this, I'd very much recommend that you watch that webinar. It's also got a very good chair as well, who shall remain unnamed at this particular moment in time. But it is available on the ICAS website, and we have given you the link there. And we will be producing our own first-time implementation guide, which will be available very shortly and will be contained within the December audit news. Or at least a link will be there to the particular document. So just for me to close this up with thank you for watching, and really thanks again to Lesley for giving us the time, her insights and the experience she has had over the last few years when she's been involved, you know, in implementing a system which will comply with ISQM 1. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.